welcome to the Nick Lugo Show. Today you are going to experience Lisa Erickson, and we really discuss some of the most important topics of our day, which is pretty much how do people relate to each other? How do people commune? How do people talk to each other in a day where it's so difficult to define the social norms, the social boundaries? How can I, be less awkward? How can I flirt? How can I handle all of these weird social problems that we really haven't learned how to deal with as a culture? And she deals a lot with, in her practice, she deals with energy healing, chakra. She's a Tibetan Buddhist, certified Tibetan Buddhist. Like she is she's immersed herself completely in the human experience. And today we're going to be answering a lot of questions about exactly that. So I give to you Lisa Erickson.
And that is really where I consider my work to be. It is kind of integrative in terms of therapeutic, drawing on human psychology and science in terms of brain science, and spiritual in terms of drawing on energy body mappings that really come from the East. So
interesting. So explain to everybody exactly what you do, how do you bring all this stuff together, and how do you help people?
Yeah. Well, I am an energy worker, and that means I guide people through ways of working with their energy or subtle body. The energy or subtle body, we have an energy anatomy, just like we have a physical anatomy. And really, there's been traditions all over the world historically that have mapped energy bodies. But the ones that we're most familiar with in the East, or that many people have come into contact with without even realizing it, is the meridian mapping that comes through Chinese medicine, which acupuncture is based on, right? Which is now actually covered by most insurance for many things, including headaches and things like that. And acupuncture is based on an energy body mapping. And then the chakras, which really come out of spiritual traditions from the East, India, Tibet, Japan. And although many people think, I don't have chakras, just maybe they have to do with yoga. But in fact, physical yoga postures, which many people now do in their gym, right? They are not just based on a mapping of the muscles and the joints. They're based on chakra mappings. And a particular sequence of postures that you do, they're not just designed to stretch your body in a certain way. They're actually designed to smooth energy flows based on chakra mapping. So they're considered, kind of energy medicine or energy wellness. And you don't have to know that when you're doing the postures, but that's their foundation. And those kinds of postures were developed originally as a precursor to sitting meditation, with the idea being that if you smoothed your energy body, which links to our psyche, you already had a certain level of quiet in your mind. So then when you sat down to formal meditation, it was that much easier. So that's where these things come from.
Yeah, it's really interesting. And I just want to ground it like a little bit more,
Yes.
like it starts with such a wide abstract proposition. Then you say it goes down to yoga. Another thing it goes down into is just our daily lives in general, right? Like humans don't really realize how much energy and, like we talk about vibes all the time, play into our daily relationships, right? Like what makes a friendship a friendship? What makes a relationship a relationship? It's really just the vibes that somebody gives. Somebody could say they're good vibes, bad vibes. You could say that, for example, for somebody who has antisocial personality disorder, or someone who we could just see is really antisocial, the only thing that they do wrong per se is give off the wrong vibe, and these energies are just literally the way that we humans run. And it's really weird that we don't take into account, balancing these energies and trying to figure out how to actually, maximize them so that we can live a good social life.
That's right. Yeah, we think of it totally as being sort of body cues or emotional cues. But a lot of times someone can be on the surface presenting themselves a certain way and you can feel something else. And you'll be like, God, I really feel like so-and-so doesn't like me. But there won't have been anything that they said or did that you can point to, but you can feel something about it. Or, wow, he seemed really angry, but I don't know why. He had a smile on his face. We read these things all the time. And it's really this whole other level of vibrational exchange that's happening underneath our physical and body cues. And they're all interrelated. But you're right. We really all are operating on that level all the time when we're drawn to someone. It often has to do with the state, the mood that they're in, or the energy that they're putting out. And the opposite when we're, feeling an aversion to someone.
So tell me exactly what you do in terms of changing these energies, summoning these energies, pretty much, what your practice really is about.
Yeah. There's different levels. For someone, a lot of people, obviously, that come to meditation or energy work, it starts with stress management. That's probably
Yeah.
the number one reason that someone, especially in this day and age, might originally turn to meditation. And there's many kinds of meditation. Some you're stilling your mind, you're focusing on your breath. I practice many of them and teach them too. In terms of chakra meditation, which is focusing on energy centers, you're adding this level where each energy center has to do with the kind of energy, a certain energy you're trying to develop more of in your life, right? So it's very common, for example, to focus on the heart energy, which would be the heart space, and you meditate there as you're sitting in meditation, which would be the chakra most connected to shifting our energy in relationship to other people, right? And that's one level. You can just kind of do chakra meditation. Other levels of energy work that I do interactively with people is different release techniques and things like that that are about, for example, if we were working with the heart chakra and themes of relationship, clearing blocks that have developed to someone connecting with others, which can be rooted in trauma. I work a lot with individuals who've had past trauma. It could be rooted in, conditioning or experiences when they were growing up. For someone who believes in past lives, it could be past lives, right? So there could be a lot of contributing factors. Some people were really working almost like a therapist, but we're adding in this layer of the energetic component. What areas of your psyche, of your energy are blocked?
Yeah, I mean, I see that really, really all the time. Like, I practice hypnotism, and hypnotism is very similar, but also different, right, to exactly what you do. But a lot of it is really focused on being able to help somebody's sort of, not conscious, but awareness, we'll say consciousness at a deeper level. And a lot of the people I deal with are people who are dealing with this sort of social underlying anxiety that comes in. And, it's weird because, I struggle with social anxiety for a pretty long amount of time. And it's really weird. Like, you don't know that you're anxious during the conversation. You realize afterwards, you're like, wait a second, that was a really, really anxious conversation in which there were really bad vibes going on because I was just giving this, this anxiety sort of, we'll say vibe going out, and it causes a lot of problems. So what exactly do you do with those sort of people?
Yeah. Well, really, I have a few different techniques that we would use. Usually let's just start with memories, examples within the last week of where you felt that you were caught in that anxiety, right?
Mhm.
Without getting into the sources or the roots. We're going to get into that later. And we're going to work with that experience, going back into that experience and feeling as the anxiety is, say, rising up, where you feel it in your body, right? And what we're realizing now in all sorts of healing traditions, including Western medicine, is somatic work, or work that starts in the body, is really the most effective. So some people will be like, oh, my stomach immediately clenches, I get butterflies, my shoulders get tense. Some people will be like, oh, I clench my jaw. People will begin to notice these physical cues, and we will practice breathing through releasing the physical cues first, giving someone a tool for noticing, oh, I'm starting to clench my jaw. I'm going to relax that, because it feels too big to kind of take on the anxiety, right? So it's like, let's just start with a tool you can use in the moment. I think the second layer then, as we begin to work, I will be really helping to construct a particular chakra sequence or meditation that they can do on their own for a few minutes a day that is linked to feeling safe. So that's usually going to involve the root chakra, for anyone interested in what the chakras are connected to. The heart chakra, maybe if someone really experiences their anxiety is not being able to speak clearly, might involve the throat chakra. It varies per person, The third phase is going to be, okay, what's the roots of this? And with that, we may be working with memories. We may be working with specific experiences. We may be working with a genetic proclivity for anxiety if it runs in someone's family. Depending on the level of anxiety, I may be advising that someone is also in therapy. And I actually have quite a few clients at any given time who are both in therapy and doing energy work with me because they feel they work together. So it really depends on, the person. And I think people probably do that with hypnotherapy as well, right? They may be doing traditional talk therapy and hypnotherapy. So I think everyone needs to find, especially if someone's dealing with past trauma, they need to find the combination of modalities that works for them, right? And it's really different for each person.
Yeah, well, that's one of the big things, especially for people who are experiencing trauma. And I definitely want to get into exactly what you do because you handle with
Yeah.
a lot of sexual assault survivors. A big thing about it is like, not only do you need to sort of talk it through and understand it, but at the same time, you need to put a narrative to it. And that's one of the big things that hypnotherapy does. And is that what you guys do a little bit? Like hypnotherapy really gives someone a narrative. Like, okay, this crazy thing happened. I got to learn, okay, how did this actually help me? What did I learn from this? All of these things so that you could actually put something on it instead of it just being this chaotic something.
Exactly, because I think any successful trauma therapy does that in some way, shape, or form, because we define trauma as an experience you can't integrate, right? So to
Yeah.
be able to integrate it, you do have to build some narrative around it. I love how you expressed that. That was perfect. I do that in my work. So that's not what all energy workers do. And that's why I call myself an energy worker rather than a healer. Because there are modalities like, say, Reiki, where really someone, you go in, you may lie down, and someone is channeling energy into you, right? And this also can be very, very helpful. But there isn't a talk component. So usually most people that are dealing with trauma would need to combine that with a modality that does contribute that narrative, right? So I do, because my sessions are both talk based and guided work based. We are often working with that. What happens, maybe we're going into the feeling of the anxiety and someone all of a sudden gets a flash of something related to the past. And then I have different techniques for how we might work with that, including externalizing it, talking with that feeling, like almost splitting yourself in two,
Yeah.
talking with that person, that anxiety itself, right? Or the fear, combined with energy work. Because so much with trauma is often not feeling safe in the body. So there's a lot of energy work techniques for kind of grounding someone in their lower chakras that can be very helpful.
Yeah, so actually, before I got on this podcast, to prepare, like 15 minutes before, I did one of your guided meditation sessions and one of your MP3s. You could find them on, where could they find your MP3 meditation
Yeah.
session?
Well, I have some on my mostly on my website,
That's what
enlightenedenergetics.com.
it was,
I
yeah.
have some that are tied to my book, Chakra Empowerment for Women, and others that are not tied to that book. So that are quite old. I hope you got a good one, because I was just thinking I need to go through here and clean. Some of these are 10 years old and I want to update them for sound quality, right? The way
Yeah.
we used to do these things was literally phone services, right? You didn't have all these recording devices. So that's how I did the early ones. Yeah.
Yeah, wow. I mean, yeah, the audio was a little bit off, but once you get in that zone, it's like
Yeah.
it really doesn't matter. Like you did a great job. You have like it's a basic introduction, just like for all of the different ones, and
Yes.
then you pick exactly which one you want to go with. And getting back to it, like that was exactly what I was. That was exactly the one that I took. It was something like seeing the anxious you, seeing the, problem you, the you that you don't want to be, and sort of, you said severing the connection between them. So it's imagining like a cord connecting you two and taking scissors and cutting it off. And I think, that symbolism, like being able to really like see that type of personality is something that's really, really huge.
Yeah. That's a lot of what energy work is. It's like when we react to things, it overtakes us. In that moment, we are our anxiety, we are our anger. And what
Yeah.
you're trying to do is, all of these tools do on one level, is try to get you a sense of, no, you're a being experiencing anxiety in that moment.
Yep.
So can we connect you with the being? And then can you experience the anxiety as a state, a transient state that you can work with? And sometimes cutting it away is helpful. Sometimes externalizing it, almost like an imaginary second you, and like sending compassion to that part of you, right? Because sometimes we can get stuck in this thing of, oh, I hate when I get in anxiety. And it's like you're creating this self-loathing for that part of you. So sometimes I work a lot with people on, no, let's take this part that you feel is really challenging, this part of you, and let's just practice sending it compassion, right? Trying to change your relationship to it so you don't feel like you're in a battle with yourself, right? You're trying to heal and integrate all the different parts of you and assure the parts of you that don't feel safe that you are safe. And over time, that will help contribute to a lower stress point, right? A lower average level of anxiety.
Yeah, that's a really like Buddhist mantra, and it really like
Yes.
makes sense to me. It's like that anxious you is still a part of you.
Yeah.
Like it's still, there's something within you that you haven't resolved, or there's some problem that you haven't experienced. And if you just try to like fight it head on, like you said, it doesn't really, you're not solving the reason for the anxiety. You're just trying to fight the anxiety as a symptom instead of really getting to the root cause. So yeah, I mean, like seeing it as you is something that I just find the most powerful. I actually had somebody that I was hypnotizing the other day, and one of the big things that I sort of emphasized to him is like the feeling of must is really one of the biggest problems that kind of goes with anxiety. Like I must get a good grade on this test, or I must make friends with this person. I must continue this social interaction, whatever it is. Like all of these things contribute to the anxiety, and that's all due to some underlying need of, well, I really need this social friendship, and I really need this for me. And yeah, like you can see how it spirals out.
Yeah, exactly. Oh, so many interesting points in there. I know I often work with this idea of, why do you need it, right? I
Yeah.
work with one technique that is actually based on a Tibetan Buddhist ritual, but it's been secularized and non-Buddhist therapists use it. It's called feeding your demons. And you externalize this part of you, anxiety or whatever, and you ask, what do you want? And that part wants to get an A on the test, right? What do you really need? Oh, I need validation, right? Or I need, to feel like I can get into a good college, whatever it is. And then, okay, how will it make you feel if you get that? Oh, it'll make me feel safe and secure. Like so often that's underneath. So then you work with, okay, how can I feel just safe and secure right here in this moment, right? Regardless of how I do on the test, right? Can I increase that sense of feeling safe and secure as a vibration in my body so it isn't dependent on this outcome, right? So
Yeah.
that's a lot of the way I work, is working with those needs. That's a big piece of getting to the underlying layers.
That was broken down beautifully, absolutely beautifully, because that's one of the big things for people who don't have anxiety, or for the people who've overcome their anxiety, is like, I don't need to go anywhere. I'm good where I am. Like I'm actually enjoying this moment, and I don't like the idea of setting a goal to pursue something that you could have in this moment, which is a huge Buddhist principle, right?
Yeah.
It's futile. It's not necessary at all.
Yeah. I know so much of stress management is learning to find that, and trauma response too. One of the first techniques, which maybe you work with too, for someone who experiences really kind of almost paralyzing anxiety or a trauma trigger, is, okay, take a breath in that moment and notice 3 things in your environment that are related to your senses. And be like, okay, I hear a bird. I see the color green over there. I smell a flower from the other room, right? Like and that will immediately cut through the worst of the physical response, right?
Yeah.
And so it really is just like come into this moment, because if you're panicking or stressed, it is tied to some sort of projected outcome.
Yeah, and you're hyper focused. You're hyper focused on something, so allowing for them to see the things in their environment diminishes that.
Yeah. And it's interesting because that's also a technique for connecting with the root chakra, which is linked to that feeling of being safe in your body. So it's sort of, no matter how you look at it, psychologically, energetically, it's, doing that same thing, getting you grounded in your body and in the present moment.
Wow. Yeah. I mean, so I think that's a perfect lead into just the thing that you do the most, which is helping these sexual assault survivors, these people. And the reason why I really want to talk to you about sexual assault is because I think that science doesn't do it enough justice. You can't really bring somebody into a lab who's experienced sexual assault. First of all, you can barely get someone in the lab to do that. And second of all, to inquire on them and question them and expect to receive good answers is really just an impossible thing. So you deal with essentially a lab, but really you're dealing with it on some sort of energetic level, and you're working to help them, and that's why they come to you. So I think you have a really good sample, a really good understanding of what it's like to be a sexual assault survivor. Maybe a flawed sample, because there are some people who will go to you. There's one type of person who might go to you and one type of person who might not go to you and who might be too afraid. But, you experience that in scientific studies all the time, the people who volunteer and the people who don't. And yeah, like these people have had their safety and security just absolutely blown out of the water. I think there was some study in the UK where 97% of women were sexually assaulted in some way, and that includes catcalling. But still, right, there's this feeling of your safety and your security being undermined. So tell me sort of the psychology or the energy levels of what is it like to actually experience something like that, and what do they really have to go through?
Yeah. Well, and it's interesting you brought up that study, because I think that as a culture, really as a world, is what we're starting to grapple with, right? Is the way certain people feel safe and others don't. And what is it like to walk around with different experiences, right? So I have a 15-year-old daughter, and the other day she was going out running on a very busy trail. She usually wears a t-shirt. She was really hot. She comes in and she's like, do you think I can go out in my shorts and my sports bra? Because sometimes men will catcall me when I'm running, and I'm afraid there's going to be more of that if I just wear my sports bra and not my t-shirt. And I just felt like, geez, this is where we're at. She can't go jogging on a public trail. You know what I mean? And the reason she was asking is because it was 95 degrees out, right? So she didn't want to have to wear that extra layer. So that's where we're at, and I think there's a lot of different versions of that. People get ostracized for other things as well. It's not just about gender. Yeah. Yeah, I think it's so much about helping people feel safe. And I think in their body in the moment, and being able to separate, out from the response that is as if I'm never safe because of that past assault, and the actual, am I in this moment, am I safe, right? Because what happens with trauma of any type, and it could be a car accident, it could be a war veteran, is that they're walking around in the world not feeling safe no matter what, right? Yeah. And there can be unconscious triggers in their environment that heighten it, that are related to what happened that they're not even aware of. And so they're just always in this hypervigilant state of what is going to happen, right?
Yeah, and that's like from a psychological, neurological perspective, like it's a scary thing. Like, yeah, you say hypervigilant, like you're walking around super stressed out, always, setting up all these barriers and boundaries between the people around you just because you feel so afraid of the potentials that could happen to you. And they've shown, sexual assault, the thing about sexual assault is that you can't really get good data on it, but for PTSD, you could get incredible data on it. And for people who have PTSD, which obviously is very similar, you have a lot of post-traumatic stress from being sexually assaulted, their amygdala, which is the thing that controls fear, grows in size like crazy. And their hippocampus, which is the thing that controls learning, memory, and really like growth, shrinks to about 1/3 the size. And this is postpartum, post-death. And it's like, wow, like that is huge.
Yeah. And that's based on assault. And then obviously I work with a lot of abuse survivors too. And we see the same thing, that as a child grows up in a home in which they didn't feel safe, and that could be sexual abuse, but it could be other things, being in a home with an alcoholic, other types of physical abuse, emotional abuse, right? Any environment in which you aren't safe, that same sort of brain development skews that way. And then it's a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? Because the brain, as it builds those neural pathways, it just gets stronger and stronger. So how do you actually break that and start to reverse it? The body, the individual has to have experiences of sitting in, feeling relaxed, right? So that's what you're trying to give them through hypnotherapy. I'm trying to do it through meditation, chakra work. Yeah. It has to have safe spaces and moments where the brain and the body experience something else. So those neural pathways aren't the only thing. Those neural pathways of hypervigilance aren't the only thing getting stronger and stronger and stronger. And then you have to be working on the deeper issues of, how this developed, integrating that experience, shifting the vibration, right? So if nothing else, that's what I'm trying to give someone. Can you do 5 minutes a day of sitting there focused on your root chakra and your heart and saying, I am safe, and magnifying those vibrations of those two chakras that are linked to feeling that way? And that'll be the first thing often they'll have someone do, because even just those 5 minutes, the brain is not in that hypervigilant state if they can experience that. Yeah. This modality is not for everybody. And I think that's the reality. Like you said, I attract a certain type of person. Other people are going to respond to other modalities. And sometimes I'll refer people to other modalities. You have to find what works for you. And that's really, really individual.
Okay, so give me the specific templates of the sort of people that come in. And obviously it's really tough to put people into groups like this, but to try to understand the different psychologies of somebody who has been sexually assaulted, like it seems like there's the type of person that is hypervigilant, but then there's also the type of person who kind of just like blocks it off and becomes sexually promiscuous, right? Tell me about all these different type of templates and the people who sort of come in and how they cope with this sexual assault.
Yeah. So sexual promiscuity is more common when someone has been sexually abused as a child or assaulted as a teenager. Essentially what happens, because so much sexual abuse, childhood sexual abuse, really occurs with someone you know. So it's an authority figure that was supposed to be a trusted figure. It's usually a family member, a teacher, a coach. It's, you know, some religious figures, all these stories that have been in the news, right? So what happens is that and there is a lot of psychological manipulation that goes along with that, right? But the message that the child receives, and often the abuse was before they even knew what sex was this is what love is. And this is where your value is. This is where attention is. This is how you get validated. So as they hit teenage years and they do come into their sexual self, this whole relationship to sex is already skewed by this messaging they've received from their abuser. And the promiscuity is sort of a way of playing that out. This is what love means, right? Or this is how I get attention. This is how I get value and worth. And so that needs to be reprogrammed, reframed, right? Understanding sexuality in another way, really creating a sense of self-worth that is not tied to that at all, right?
Yeah.
So the other direction, yeah, go ahead if you want to speak to that first.
No, yeah, I mean, it makes a lot of sense, like to parse out the difference between like the person who's assaulted as a kid and the person who's assaulted in, let's say, college, right? Because I'm in college and I see it all the time. You know, for someone who's sexually assaulted as a kid, it's not your friends who are doing it, right? And therefore, it doesn't lead to as many trust issues, right? If you're at a party and you get sexually assaulted and it's done by somebody who is essentially a stranger that you've been walking around with and could potentially be anywhere, then it leads to these huge trust issues. So I could see the difference. Yeah.
I think trust issues are common either way, because when you're younger, it's a adult that you were supposed to trust, right? So people can be like, it doesn't make sense to me. Why would someone get promiscuous, but they're claiming they were sexually assaulted, or, and we get all into all this victim blaming. Well, it's very complicated. If your self-worth and the culture, frankly, is telling you this is what validates you, right? Mm-hmm. Sexual attention, then, that's going to be part built into your psyche. Then what we have is so many victim blaming and secrecy things. The things with childhood abuse and assault as teenagers, as we know, is many people never share it. They're ashamed of it, or they do tell someone, and all too often tell a family member, and the family member will just be like, okay, don't tell anyone else that. Yeah. I'll try to keep you away from Uncle Joe, but don't tell anyone else. So the message still is that somehow there's no ramifications for Uncle Joe. The ramifications are to me, right? Yeah. And I have to hold this in. So there's all this secrecy stuff that does create also a lot of lingering issues. Then you have people that go to the other end of the spectrum and really shut down to sexual contact altogether and become very walled off and self-protective. And it's really, and you have people in between, but those are kind of the two extremes of how someone might respond. And in general, as a culture, we tend to understand the response of shutting yourself down, and we don't understand the promiscuity, but they're really the same thing.
That's so interesting. So yeah, explain how they're, well, okay, so you're saying they're the same thing because they have the same root cause? Yeah. Okay.
And it's really an issue of, self-worth and feeling shame, right? Yeah. And in one case, it's like that shame causes you to completely shut yourself off. And in the other case, that shame causes you to sort of escape into maybe sexual activity that's not healthy. Yeah. Seeking love, right? Thinking that somehow it's going to be different. Someone's actually going to love you. Through that activity, right?
Yeah, like it's completely connected. Everything is connected because, of course, that person was your trusted person. So tell me, how do you go through, right? How do you, for both of the different, let's say, templates, how do you handle each of them?
Yeah. Well, and of course, those are extremes, and we have lots of variation in between, but they represent two energetic types. So this person who's really walled themselves off, they usually have a very strong navel chakra, often very successful. I mean, I've worked with many individuals who were highly successful, for example, in the external world and essentially had no sexual life. And it really was that, they put all their energy into that. So from the external world, they were extremely accomplished, right? No problems. No one would ever guess this in their history, right? So we're really working then with someone who has a really strong navel chakra. That's how they go through life as a survivor, powering through, which is what that energy center represents. So what we're doing energetically is working with letting that go a bit, opening up the other chakras and experiences and vibrations associated with the other chakras, fundamentally trying to feel safe in the body so they can begin to explore sexuality. And then we're working with those trauma memories if needed, depending on what other work someone has done, to again help create that integrative narrative. This happened to me, so I developed these particular patterns to cope, but that's ended up shutting me off in certain ways. I now want to open up in those ways, right? We need to create that narrative.
Yeah, it seems like they were almost denying themselves a little bit, right? So, this is a big problem. It seems like they're attaching themselves to something like the traditional masculine, like energy or archetype or whatever. It seems like they're sort of saying, I'm going to shut down all of my emotions, shut down all of my social goals, and just sort of go for achievement.
Yeah, exactly. And because that feels safe, like that will bring me safety. It's all about if I can just control my whole world, achieve success as our society has defined it, maybe then I'll feel safe. So it's really, but then it becomes a very controlling personality sometimes, right?
Yeah.
And any relationships will be control based. And some of these individuals, by the time they get to me, sometimes it's because they've had issues with anger management. And originally they come to me for, I need anger. Now that is because it's like if you've developed this over time, this safety is based on feeling everything's in control. As soon as someone does something that threatens your control, you go into fight mode, right? We talk about trauma response, fight, flight, or flee, right? So sometimes when someone comes to me and they want to work on anger, I'm always like, what else might be going on? And sometimes this will be what unpacks. Okay, there's this real control personality that's developed. It's made them very successful, but it's actually rooted in trauma. And they can still be successful without that level of needing control that causes them to go into fight mode all the time.
Yeah, I mean, you just described, obviously this isn't the cause of every female workaholic, but you just described workaholism, right? Workaholism is essentially taking all of your goal structures and all of your mental resources and just putting it into something that's external, putting it into something that's goal driven.
Yeah. Yeah. And sometimes that may be trauma based. I think it's often, especially for men, worth based. Like men are conditioned, well, now men and women, but men in particular are still very conditioned that their worth is based on their success in the world, right? Even more than women. And I have 2 girls and a boy, 2 of which are boy-girl twins. So I see how this gender conditioning is still so prevalent, right?
So,
yeah.
Well, how so?
Well, that you still find that although there's so much that has shifted around gender conditioning, I think it's still skewed towards boys receiving the message, your worth is in your accomplishments. Mm-hmm. And girls, your worth is in your likability.
Yeah, I could see it. Well, here's the thing.
And that skews things so much,
Yeah, I mean, here's the thing. So like I'm in college, right? And in college, I like to associate the sort of, we'll say, the sex market as a free market, if that makes sense, right? So as opposed to a contrived market such as monogamy and marriage and relationships, where one person has to go with one male, one female, or one person with one person, right? And that's really the social, cultural rule that we've enforced. But in college, a man can get with as many women as he wants, and a woman can get with as many men as she wants, or, whatever. And that leaves for some men to be ousted and some women to be ousted. And there's this big discrepancy in this free market, and if you were to look back into essentially all of human history, 40% of men were sexually successful and brought their genes onto the next generation, and 80% of women were able to do that. And the reason why is because obviously it takes a lot less investment for a man to have a child than a woman. Right. So, and I ask myself this question all the time, like how biologically rooted is it and how socially rooted is it? Because the fact that men have to go for achievement, a big thing is women like resources, like that's a big thing in on Tinder. When you go on Tinder, a lot of my friends met girls on Tinder, and the first thing that they say is the girls. I'm like, why'd you meet them? Why'd you go on Tinder? And they're like, I was looking for a guy with a boat. I was looking for a guy who had a yacht. I was looking for a guy who was able to give me this amazing luxury life that I'm really looking for. And I could feel that pressure, right? As a guy, like, of course I could feel that pressure to be like, okay, I need to gain resources, make money so that I could have a higher level of girls and be able to get more girls. Like it's such a strong pressure. So sure. Yeah. What do you think about that? That's just.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And then what are the pressure the girls are getting? Because how are the guys screening on Tinder? Oh. They're probably not looking for resources, but it's almost entirely physically based, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
So the woman, the message they're getting is it's about my physical and my, whatever. The presentation, the message the guys are getting is, oh yeah, looks matter, but you can override that if you're really successful, if you have a lot of money, right? So and so we're all trapped. I mean, because that's not healthy for either side. That's not healthy for either side. And, this is why actually I'm a huge supporter of like the gender fluidity movement, because what it's really about to me is allowing, trying to break down this conditioning so that we can all own all aspects of ourselves, right? We should all feel, we should all find things in which we can achieve and be successful in, because that's the economy we live in. We want everyone to be able to make a living. We want everyone to be happy in their job. That would be the ideal, right? Both sides should be pursuing that, right? And we also want everyone to feel good in their body and feel about how they look. That's not a problem either, but it shouldn't be this gender-based market based on this, like you're winning if on this side you're scoring the guys because of your looks, and over here you're scoring the girls because of your achievements. That is so skewed, and it's forcing people who are individuals, to overemphasize one side of themselves at the expense of the rest of themselves, right?
That's a really interesting question, so like we see that, right? We're having this problem with, yes, exactly what you're talking about. How does someone balance it? Like I go to the gym all the time and I see girls doing their, workouts to make their butt look bigger and to look as good as they possibly can. Of course, guys are doing the same thing at the weight room. So how exactly do we psychologically, energetically balance it so that it's not like we really need to do it, but at the same time, like maybe do we want to really move ourselves up in the market, or is that really not important at the end of the day?
Yeah, I mean, from where I sit now at 54, it's not important, right? Like when I look at the meat market of college, which did exist when I went in the 80s too, because it was pre-AIDS actually, so maybe it was even, crazier, I don't know. But you look back now and you're like, oh gosh, none of that mattered. People find the relationships that have lasted, people find they connect on another level, and then none of that stuff matters, right? But it feels like it really matters at that age because it's really about validation from the external world. So as a culture, what we need to shift is, how do you grow up so that you're truly valuing yourself, getting to know yourself, valuing yourself for who you are, what's unique about yourself, and others too. And that's the level you're looking to connect at. And that sounds very pie in the sky, but that's ideally where we're trying to get to. And then it's not so gender-based. And yes, you can still want to be as attractive as you can as an act of self-love, not as validating your worth, so that when you look in the mirror and you have a bad hair day, or you have zits, or you've gained a couple pounds on vacation, you're not filled with self-loathing, which is what happens when you're on that, or you fail a test and you think, oh, now I'll never get into the college I wanted. You think that's a huge, your life is over, right? Yeah. Those are the problems. Now, unfortunately, I mean, I love social media, but social media has exacerbated that in this.
Of course.
Because it's so visually based and it's so like post your accomplishments based. Those are the two things we do. So it's fed this even more. And I have 3 teenagers. So I'm like so hyper aware of this, right? And so it is a cultural change that I think we all need to be working on. Yeah. And going inward is, to me, the answer, and cultivating that as like what life is actually about.
Well, that's what it seems like, like I see it all the time in college and with girls and with guys too. Like I see it all the time. It's like, especially when it comes to like a relationship, like getting into a relationship, there's so much insecurity there. There's way too much insecurity there, to the point where somebody is getting into these like 2-week, 3-week relationships, these sort of like flings, to the point where maybe you're looking for a long-term thing, but the only thing you're really looking for in that 2 to 3-week fling is something like validation, something like, okay, getting this really deep bond connection with this one person, and then not really looking for the long-term prospects, because there's so much underlying problems that exist underneath. And like what you're really saying is, to be able to get into a relationship, and I think this is something that everybody can agree on, to be able to get into a relationship, you need to be mentally and emotionally healthy.
Yeah.
You
and
need
self-aware and self-aware. Yeah.
Explain,
and you can actually, two people in a relationship, I've often had individuals where both people in a relationship had past trauma. And it can actually be part of their healing to be working through that trauma together. But you have to have two people really committed to vulnerability and self-awareness for that to occur. Right?
Explain what you mean by self-awareness.
Just an awareness, meaning you've looked at why you have the patterns you have.
Oh, yes.
When we talk about, say, that control anger pattern, you're not still in the phase where you're just doing it. At some part of you has gone, this is a problem. Why am I like this? And you've started to look at the past and how these patterns developed, and you started to get into tools that can help you change it, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's one of the most important things. Like, I see a lot of people trying to get into a relationship just so they could sort of cling on to someone, like you get into a relationship, and the only reason that they do that is something like they feel so alone by themselves. They feel so unvalidated by themselves. I see this a lot with people with depression. It's like, if you do that, you feel so low all the time. Like, all you're looking for is that one person to cling on to, that so that they could, so that you have a pair and that you don't feel as lonely, and then you always have someone to be with. It's like, yes, but then there are so many problems associated with that, particularly becoming them and not being able to create your own personality first and exist within a relationship. You just kind of gel into them.
Absolutely. Or the other thing that can happen is you've really projected onto that person someone they're not. And eventually that projection is going to be burst. It's too much pressure for the other person, or they never really were that in the first place. When that bubble bursts, then it can be devastating. If someone has underlying mental health issues, really, they can just completely fall apart at that point, right? So yeah, it's not a healthy way of being.
Yeah.
Relationships as escape. They use it as validation. They also can use it as escape from feeling like depression. And in that case, you're getting a temporary high in the honeymoon phase, but eventually you're just right back where you were. You haven't dealt with the underlying patterns.
Okay, so let me ask you a question, which has really been on my mind recently, and it's a study that I don't really know what to do with, and I don't really know how to handle. Are you married by any chance?
I am married, yes.
You are married, so you could help me out, especially with your expertise and knowledge. So there was a study where they brought in two types of people, right? They brought in one couple who was in a relationship for 2 weeks, right? That really honeymoon phase, fling type relationship. And they committed to be together for the rest of their lives, blah, blah, blah. And then you have the people who have been together for 5 years and are engaged, married, long-term relationships, have really, they've gotten over their honeymoon phase, but they still stuck it out. And they did neuroimaging studies where in the MRI scanner, they show them pictures, just flashes of people they know and all their friends and all that. And then at one moment, they'll flash their significant other. And when they do that, very simply, for the 2-week people, their dopamine centers go crazy. So the dopamine centers are the ones that pursue pleasure and fun and excitement and just very simply, and bonding and all of these things. And that's sort of the creator of the honeymoon phase. And then for the people who've been together for 5 years, they did the same exact study. They flashed the pictures. And when they saw their significant other, their dopamine centers didn't light up at all. Their pleasure centers, none of that lighted up at all. The thing that lighted up in their brain was something akin to security and, that old chair that you really like, that you could just like melt into at the end of the day, or like that house that gives you such safety and security. Nothing like the other one. So it leaves a bunch of doubts for relationships in general, right? And that's sort of what I'm getting at. The doubt is something like, why would you get into a relationship if the person that you end up being with is really not there for potentially love, right? Nothing like that. It's really akin to like an old chair or something that just gives you safety and security.
Well, first of all, why do you say that that isn't a form of love, right? Like love, I think, is not something that can be measured on that kind of scan. It's something beyond that, right? But
Okay.
what I would say is you should be questioning all of those things. I think we should be questioning personally. This is obviously my opinion. We should, even though I'm married, we should be questioning the idea that that's where everybody should be headed, right? It is
Yeah.
a big choice, both in terms of relationship preference and lifestyle. I didn't marry until I was 35. I had my kids at 38 and 40, and I'm lucky that that worked out. Obviously, that doesn't always work out for everyone. So I did have, many, many years of the single life. I wasn't really sure I ever would get married. At a certain point, my priorities shifted, and that kind of relationship and love was what I wanted. And
Hmm.
it creates a foundation. Both of us have been able, it creates a foundation of support. You build this family life together, which at that point in my life, I loved. I didn't want it in my 20s. I did really, love the soccer games in this and all that birthday parties when I got to that point in my life and I'd been able to develop my career to a certain point. And then you become a foundation for each other to do the other things that are important to you, and you don't really feel like you want to focus on dating and all that. You want to come home to that comfortable person, but that doesn't mean you still can't have a good sex life and things like that, right? It doesn't mean, just means maybe that's not the first part of your brain that lights up, but you
Yeah.
still have that side of your life together, right?
Okay.
So but also it's not for everybody, right? Maybe some people are serial monogamous. Maybe some people are not meant to be monogamous. I think we have a lot of social conditioning around what life is supposed to be, and it does need to open up. And people need to feel free to pick what works for them.
Okay, yeah, because that's what the only thing is like, and this is exactly why I was getting on it, and you hit it perfectly with the sexual and the love life and all that.
Yeah.
It's like it misses the sort of, let's say, archetype, right? It misses the dream, which is, you're 85 on a dance floor, you and your wife, or me and my wife, you and your husband, and still dancing, and like the passion's still there, the love's still there, and you could still just like dance to some old classical music or like whatever, but the love's still there, the passion's still there. It seems like that part. And there was a study that was done on this. They said that 13% of current married couples experience that into their long,
Yes.
into their deep ages, and yeah, like it feels like it misses that and sort of settles for something like security.
Yeah. Well, and I think marriage goes in phases when you're with someone for a long time. But yes, to get married, you're giving up that constant day-to-day high. How would you keep that? Well, you just have to keep getting in new relationships every year or two, right?
Yep.
Well, then what you're missing out on is other things, the security, right? The building a family and a life together, right? All these shared memories. So I think marriage goes through phases. I think marriage is going through a big overhaul right now, and it does have to do with changes in gender conditioning that are occurring too, right? We need a different kind of relationship to evolve. So we'll see if that happens with your generation.
Yeah, I mean,
I hope so.
we're a weird generation, and
Well, and I have my oldest one is heading to college next year, so she's in that same year, and the other two are sophomores in high school. So yeah, it's interesting to me. They relate to relationships so much differently. High school dating, there doesn't really seem to be high school dating. It's just like hanging out. It's so different than it was in my generation.
yeah, well, that's a huge problem that I see, and this is like, tell me what you think the effects are of this. I think this is just a general problem that I see, is that just like in general, we have something like, again, I like to think of it as something like a sexual market, even though that's kind of low. If you think of it as a sexual market, I see that there's a lot of people who have unfulfilled demands, right? And a lot of people who have unfulfilled demands on both sides. Like there are people that, guys and girls, and this is just obviously simplifying it, that just don't connect with other people because there's no communication channel to actually go and do it. Like partying is something like a sexual ritual that we have adopted in our culture, but like that's not the place that you want to develop a deep, meaningful spiritual connection with somebody at all. And I find that there's this big gap in both genders between, okay, there's one guy here who's probably perfect for one of the girls over here, and there's one girl here who's probably perfect for one of the guys over here, and they just never connect because we don't have that sort of mechanism. And especially COVID exacerbated that. What is the result of something like that?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're naming it, that people can't find each other. They can't really connect, and it all feels like superficial connections based on, different social circles of validation, and that leaves a hole in people's hearts, right? Now, I do think you always have people connecting outside of that, right? You always have the outsiders, and I would encourage people to be an outsider then. Like, be an outsider and you'll find another outsider, and then you're not actually outsiders, right? And that once you leave college, in the real world, we'll say, it's very different, right? The way that you connect and interact. So college is this bubble that has pros and cons.
Yeah, well, that's one of the things that is really weird. Like, I feel the pressure as a college kid to be into all of those things, like party and all that stuff, because that's where all the girls go and all that. But at the same time, like, that is just so inauthentic for me. Like, I am not that type at all. Like, that is just not me. So it's like, you're right. It's such a bubble where, like, it is nothing like the real world. It's like a completely different world. And yeah, it seems like so many people, and this is what I've noticed over the years, is that people try to fit themselves into that box. They try to fit themselves into that culture and say, okay, you know what, if this is where the girls are, that's where I'll go. Or if this is where the culture is going, that's where I'll go. And
doesn't work.
It's just inauthentic. Yeah. Like you're supposed to find yourself in college. You're therefore by definition losing yourself.
That's exactly right. Yeah. And again, I do think social media has exacerbated that, right? Because it emphasizes that image consciousness as opposed to connection, right? So I think it is about, being brave enough to try to focus on, well, where would I meet people where I could actually potentially find real connection? Yeah. And maybe that's actually easier post-college because you're dealing with other kinds of life issues. But people, people meet in spiritual groups, for example, meditation groups, things like that, like other places besides a party, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. And then I have one final question for you. And I think this is just exactly just hitting on this idea. What are your suggestions? What are your suggestions for at college? There's a huge sexual assault culture in that, I've had many friends and fraternities and stories and all of these things, of course, remaining anonymous, where some girl gets sexually assaulted and then by this guy in this frat, and then they just tell the guy, whenever this girl's over, you gotta leave, right? You just can't be at this one party at this one time. You're not gonna get prosecuted. There's no problem that comes with it. I've talked to many girls. A girl comes up to me, this was freshman year. She's like, hey, listen, I pretty much almost got assaulted last night. Like, there were so many problems that came with it. I say, I'm gonna go and tell somebody, and she says, no, don't do it. I'm not going to do it either. So like, what do we do about something like this sexual culture where sexual assault is just like crazy easy to be?
It is a long-term change proposition. It's like, I want to say something pie in the sky to you as an individual in college right now about, being the one to try to force the administration to make those changes and take these things seriously. The reality is it's bigger than that, right? And it's really about a cultural change. I think there has been cultural change. I mean, I know there has been. There has been on college campuses. This is taken more seriously. It varies from school to school. But we also have to view it as just generationally, how do we change this idea around sexuality, right? And how do we encourage men to view it as it's really about connection. It's not just a physical release, right, or attraction. It's about connection. So of course you want it to be consensual. How can you connect if it's not fully 100% consensual, right? Yeah. And your worth is not based on how many girls you've slept with, right? So because that is part of what feeds into that idea of conquering, right? That sex is somehow about conquering. So how do we really break down that conditioning and do away with it once and for all? And then on the women's side, really affirming your worth is not based on how many guys want you, right? So value yourself, and you have the right at any point to say no and to pursue retribution, right? For someone who doesn't honor that. So, but that's a long-term change. So I don't know what to say to you right now in your situation. I think it's very tough.
Well, that's the tough part. I could see it from both sides. So like one of the problems that you say it varies from school to school. I would say it also varies from person to person in terms of their borderline levels. You know, like there's such a gray line between what is sexual assault and what is like flirting, right? So for example, let's say I'm at a party, I put my hand on a girl's waist. A girl could easily be like, well, dude, that you just sexually assaulted me. But then
Yeah.
but then I hear it all the time. Like I have girlfriends, and they say like, oh, he put his hand on my waist and I was receptive to it. And then we ended up getting together and like all that stuff. So it seems like there's such a gray line between that. So as a guy, it's like, it's
very fuzzy because you will hear, oh, I want a man who can make the first move, right? Or I want a man who can be assertive. You're getting that message, right? Yeah. But then you're also getting the message, don't do anything without asking, right? So it's like, wait, am I supposed to ask before I hold her hand? Am I supposed to ask? Like, yeah, I think the problem is we're not having these conversations. I mean, my kids just went through their sexual health classes at high school. There's this very kind of simple section on consent, but these are the kind of conversations you have to have. You actually need in the teen years, girls and boys sitting in the classroom together and they're having this conversation. Like, what would consent be? Am I supposed to ask before I do this? Do I only need to ask if we're alone together? Or if we're in a room, is it sort of assumed that there's safety and I can put my hand on your waist and that's not considered assault? Because we all know I'm not going to go beyond that right here. I was just testing the water. Like you have to have these conversations. And one girl might say, no, I want you. And another girl might to put your hand on my waist if you're interested to signal that to me. And the other girl might say, no, I don't want anyone touching my body without asking or a signal from me. But at least you're having those conversations and it raises the complexity for everyone because right now those conversations aren't happening, right?
Exactly. And it's
discuss this with your guy friends?
Once.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's just a hard thing to discuss.
Yeah, I mean, it's so difficult because, like we humans, and here's the thing, right? Like sexuality is so under the conscious level, like attraction is so subconscious and communication in the same way is just so unconscious. So like, for example, telling someone, hey, can I touch your waist? Or, hey, can I kiss you? It's just so like contrived. It's so non-human to be able to ask these questions. And like the only problem is the more that we talk about these things, I agree. Of course, the more we talk about these things, there's so much more communication and just general understanding that you get. But then you also see like in the moment, like 93% of our communication is nonverbal. So like, what do you do about that?
No, exactly. I think it's very complicated. So I don't think there's ever going to be hard and fast rules. But if there is an environment of making people think about it, I mean, I think the reality is, you're someone who's already asking these questions. So it's very unlikely you're going to cross the line because you're asking these questions. The problem is the guy's not asking these questions that wouldn't even think twice about it. If they're in the same room, they're like, really? That could be a problem? I never thought of that. It at least starts to reframe this. And if the women are hearing the men's side of things and they're going, oh, okay, I didn't realize it was that confusing, right? I never thought might be how confusing it might be for them, right? So I think that's the value of these conversations being out there. And unfortunately, I think, there's not a lot of support for it. It's like we keep saying, oh, we need to change the culture. But, this gets into bigger topics of kind of the puritanical roots of American culture and why do we have so many issues talking about sex, because people from Latin countries in Europe are kind of like, wow, Americans are so weird about sex, right? Yeah. And so there's that whole piece of it too, that like we have more difficulty talking about things and there's roots of that in our culture.
No, and what it leads to, and this is like the thing, I think this is the thing, is that it leads to so much objectification. And I can't wrap my head around how big of an impact it has. Like you notice when we're in a social situation and you're with guys, there is men sort of gamify sex, right? We sort of gamify it. And it's like rate her out of 10, like, all of these types of mechanisms. Oh, look how hot she is, blah, blah, blah. And so when you gamify it like that, what ends up happening is people, men in particular, end up objectifying these women because it's not a girl, it's a game. And then
Yeah.
when it's not a girl, it's a game, then you don't have to consider their feelings, right?
Yeah.
When it's an object, you don't have to consider their feelings. And what I've noticed, and this is like the biggest thing, it's like men who've had sisters treat women so much differently than men who don't have sisters. And that's obviously a generalization, but there's a solid ground for that. Like
Yeah.
all of my friends who have sisters, they ended up losing their virginity a lot later. They treat women a lot more timidly, which you could say is a good thing or a bad thing, right? Like at both extremes. And yeah, like there's such a big thing that goes in with it. And it's tough to balance.
Because it's more difficult for them to view these women that are around their age, right, as their siblings may have been, as not people, right? Like they have relationships with girls that are truly people. Their sisters are people, right? So I think that's part of what happens. Now, my husband is one of 6 boys, and he's actually very good. So I don't know. Maybe that's his mother. I don't know. Maybe I don't know why.
Well, it's also socializing.
Yeah, it's also socializing, exactly, and the kind of where you placed yourself in the social culture.
Yeah, exactly. Like, I noticed that a lot of people they go for the objectifying and they kind of stick with it. But then those people who go with the objectifying don't end up getting a wife, or they fail very much because that's not a good long-term
everything was
strategy.
surface level. Yeah. No, and then of course it gets into the whole sports culture too. So we could go there too, right? Because when you talk about gamify, it's like, what do we value between video games and sports? Wow, we have a lot of male conditioning around gamifying everything, right? And gamifying life. And why aren't we giving young men other ways of relating to themselves, right? So I think it gets
God, and then you could get into porn. Like there's so much.
There is. No, I think that redefining gender and sexuality and relationships, it's really one of the defining themes for your generation. And, from my work, I'm working inwardly on the balancing of masculine and feminine energies. And I do work with men too. And that's a huge part with what we're working with, is allowing both men and women to own all sides of themselves. Those we've labeled feminine, those we've labeled masculine. That's when you talk about Carl Jung at the beginning, he talks about a full person. That's what that mandala represents, right? Truly integrating all different parts of yourself. I think of it in terms of masculine and feminine energies. There's a lot of other models to use, but really having this sense of each of us, how to create a culture where everyone is a whole person. Each person gets to pursue being a whole person. And that also gets into race issues and all that sort of the other ways that people have been blocked from owning their whole self, not just gender. There's a lot of layers to it.
Yeah, well, it's super tough. Like Carl Jung, like he talked about this all the time in connection with the anima, and the anima is the female part of the soul, right? This is very yin and yang. Even though you're masculine, you still have some feminine aspects to you. And I mean, of course it's true, right? Like the more you look into it, of course you realize that like nobody is just truly masculine and completely masculine. Like men have a trouble, obviously. The more masculine they get, the more they have a problem with emotional vulnerability. And then women, the more feminine they get, the more trouble they have with pursuing goals and things of that sort. So there's such a tough balance to strike there on both sides, because you could see exactly where I could probably say that the culture is pushing everybody towards the masculine side, right? Like pushing everybody towards that side. Is it a good thing or a bad thing? I don't know in the final analysis, but
I think it's bad. I think it's bad. I mean, in the sense that it's imbalanced, and that's one way of describing a lot of the problems that we have as a society. Is that we do have of what we would consider in terms of what we've labeled feminine and masculine, a very masculine structure for looking at things. And we have to figure out how to do it differently, how to bring the feminine in.
Well, so that's the biggest problem. And I think, you hit on it so great in your books and in your talks and all of these things. The big problem with femininity, right? Or our society's view on femininity is we say, okay, to stay with the family and the kids and all of these things, a lot of women see that as insulting, right? They see it as, come on, like, you think I can't handle, like, you think I can't play with the big boys? Like, all of these things. And this sort of push away from the femininity. And then at the same time, right, handling the kids and doing all that stuff doesn't make you money. So there's this economic push and financial push in that direction. And it's like, what do you do about that?
Well, what we did is, as we have evolved women's rights and opportunities, right, in the social sphere over the last 50 years. So we did emphasize giving women equal access to those opportunities, right? Yes. And valuing that. But we didn't change the value system that says that's better than being home. So there wasn't a corresponding push to, okay, what men would like to stay home with the kids. So each family is making the choices about what works in their household. You have it happening. You have individuals, men who have chosen to stay home, but you have much less of that, right? So truly, we still sort of bought into that model of, okay, well, the external validation in the external world is more valuable, right? As opposed to making them of equal value, and anyone of any gender can choose one or the other, and a couple is working it out, or a family system is working out what works for them. What's the best solution for them overall for this period of time? So I think that's what I mean by we sort of really focused on giving women access to the old model without trying to change the model. And when I look like with kids, right? Like, so there was this big push of equal girls in sports, right? So now there's just as many girls playing soccer as boys, but there are not as many boys in ballet as there are girls. The crossover didn't happen. We still have it labeled, girls can do anything, boys can still only do these things, right? And that doesn't help anybody.
Interesting. Yeah. I mean, I haven't really dug into that much, the male aspect of the feminine, because it's tough, right? It's tough because just not from a philosophical perspective, just from a practical perspective, that's not going to get you girls, right? Like, right?
No,
like it's.
No. Well, no, it might get you some girls, but yes, probably not yet.
Yeah.
Not till later on when they actually have to deal with these things and they're like, oh, what kind of guy do I actually want to build a life with? Then you realize that's a totally different guy than the guy you want to go home from the party from. So that's kind of the stage of life you're in, where people are thinking about who do they want to go home with a party, but not like, what kind of life do I want to build with someone, right? Because then it's a totally different thing.
Yeah, no, I mean, it makes sense. So there was this great study where, they look at the difference between men and women, and men often don't care about a woman and how much a woman accepts / rejects the culture. If a woman kind of like goes out there and defies social norms to a degree, right, then it's not that big of a deal. But when women look at men, they want to look at men who are pretty strong in the culture. They want to look at people who are socially, is inept the wrong word, socially in tune, right? Yeah. And that's a big problem, right? So the man who's in ballet is probably not very socially in tune along with our culture, right? And it's really based in our culture. And
no, so the changes have to be at that macro level, right? Like at a cultural conditioning level, for sure, to influence the individual choices and the freedom that people feel to explore all sides of themselves, right? To explore their artistic side or emotional side if they're a man.
Yeah, I know. Man, these big questions, these big conversations.
I know. We went from meditation and trauma to gender conditioning in our culture, but that's I like it.
That's where it flowed. That's where it ended up.
Where it flowed. Yeah, good.
So Lisa Erickson, thank you for coming on. Tell everybody where they could find you and tell them about your new book.
Yeah. So my website is enlightenedenergetics.com, and you can find me on Facebook and Instagram as Chakra Empowerment, or Twitter as Mommy Mystic. And my book is called, one of them is called Chakra Empowerment for Women, and the other is The Art and Science of Meditation. So thank you for this conversation. This has been really interesting for me too, speaking with someone currently in college. So I think that you're my first podcaster who is actually in college. So that's very interesting to me.
Well, then I'm honored too. Well, thank you.
Thank you. Have a good day.
Thank you for listening to this episode of The Nick Lugo Show. Always make sure to check out the sponsors in the description below, and to like, subscribe, and give 5 stars, and in whatever way you can, because, well, I hope to spread this podcast and these episodes with more people, and you could help me do that. I always love to end my podcast with one quote, and this quote is my favorite of all time. It's by Viktor Frankl in his book, Man's Search for Meaning. Ever more people today have the means to live, but but no meaning to live for. Think about that quote and, well, have a good day.